Cursed Cassettes presents. I've always been a pretty private person. My house is in a quiet neighborhood, and I like it that way. Just me, my small backyard, and the peacefulness of being left alone. So when the house next door went up for sale, and I heard someone had bought it, I didn't think much of it. New neighbors come and go, and most of the time, we don't interact beyond a friendly wave. But this time, things were different. Very different. The guy who moved in seemed normal enough at first. He was probably in his mid-40s, wore glasses, had a neatly trimmed beard, nothing out of the ordinary. The first time I saw him, he waved at me from his driveway. I waved back, and that was that. Weeks went by, and I didn't see him much. I figured he kept to himself, just like me. But then I started noticing things. At first, it was little stuff, strange, but not alarming. I'd be outside in my backyard, watering the plants or grilling, and I'd feel someone watching me. I'd look over at the neighbor's house, and there he'd be, standing at his window, staring directly at me. It was weird, but I convinced myself that maybe he was just zoning out, not really focusing on me. Except, it kept happening. Every time I'd step outside, he'd be there, standing at the same window, looking out. I'd catch his eye, and he'd quickly pull the curtain shut, like he didn't want to be seen. I tried to shake it off. I mean, people have their quirks, right? But as the days went by, it got harder to ignore. It was late one evening when things really started to take a turn. I was sitting in my living room, binge-watching some mindless TV show, when I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned to the window, and there he was again. This time outside, standing in his backyard, looking right into my house. His silhouette was barely lit by his porch light, but there was no mistaking it. It was him. I froze. My heart started pounding. I tried to tell myself that maybe he was just out for some air, but something about the way he stood there, motionless, staring at my house, gave me the creeps. I closed the blinds and tried to brush it off, but sleep didn't come easy that night. Over the next few days, things escalated. I'd come home from work and noticed things moved in my yard, like someone had been walking around. I even found footprints in the dirt near my windows. They weren't mine. I thought about calling the police, but what was I going to say? My neighbor's been staring at me, and I think he's walking around my yard. It didn't sound serious enough, at least not yet. Then, one night, everything changed. It was around 2 a.m. when I woke up to a sound, footsteps. At first, I thought I was imagining it. The house was silent, but I could hear distinct, slow footsteps crunching through the grass just outside my bedroom window. My heart raced, and I didn't dare move. I stayed still, listening, hoping the sound would go away, that it was just some stray animal. But then I heard it again, closer this time, and that's when I knew. Someone was out there, right outside my window. I forced myself to get up quietly and crept to the edge of the window. My bedroom lights were off, but the moonlight outside gave just enough illumination to see him. My neighbor was standing right outside, his face inches from the glass, staring in. I swear, my blood turned to ice in that moment. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. We locked eyes for what felt like an eternity, and then, slowly, he smiled. A twisted, unsettling grin that sent shivers down my spine. I backed away from the window, my hands trembling as I fumbled for my phone. I was about to dial 911 when I heard a knock on the window. Not a loud, aggressive knock, just a slow, deliberate tap, 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 like he wanted me to know he was still there. I couldn't take it anymore. I ran out of the bedroom, my heart pounding in my chest. I locked myself in the bathroom and finally called the police. It felt like hours before they arrived, but in reality, it was probably only a few minutes. When they got there, they searched the yard, but of course, he was gone by then. I told them everything, about the staring, the footprints, how he was outside my window in the middle of the night. They said they'd talk to him, but there wasn't much they could do without more concrete evidence. Keep your doors locked, they said, and call us if anything else happens. For the next few nights, I barely slept. I kept all the lights on and triple-checked every lock in the house. But the worst part was knowing he was still there, just next door, watching. The final straw came about a week later. I was getting ready for bed, still on edge from everything that had happened. I went to check the locks one last time before going to sleep, and as I walked past the front door, I noticed something slipped under the door. A note. I picked it up, my hands shaking as I unfolded the paper. Scrawled in messy handwriting were 3 words that made my blood run cold. I'm still watching. That was it. I called the police again, but by the time they arrived, there was no sign of him. The next morning, I packed a bag and left. I stayed with a friend for a few weeks while I made arrangements to move. I didn't even bother telling the landlord why I was breaking my lease early. I just needed to get out. To this day, I don't know what my neighbour's deal was, and I don't want to know. But I'll never forget that feeling of being watched, that slow, eerie smile, and those words, "I'm still watching." I've lived in my neighbourhood for about 5 years now, and for the most part, it's been pretty uneventful. Quiet, suburban. Everyone kind of keeps to themselves, but there's always that one house, you know? The one that feels off. For us, it was the house across the street. The man who lived there was named Mr. Riley. He was an older guy, probably in his late 60s or early 70s, and he lived alone. At first, I didn't pay much attention to him. He'd occasionally wave when he was out getting his mail, but other than that, I hardly ever saw him. But as time went on, I started noticing some odd things about his house. The blinds were always drawn, day and night, and the front yard was overgrown, like he didn't care much about appearances. There was this weird smell that seemed to drift from his place when the wind blew just right, something almost metallic, mixed with rot. Still, I figured it wasn't any of my business. Maybe he was just a bit of a recluse. But things took a darker turn one night about a year ago. It was around midnight, and I was in my living room watching TV. I remember the sound of it cutting out for a second when I heard this strange noise coming from outside. At first, I thought it was some animal scurrying around, nothing unusual. But then the noise came again. It was loud, like a thud followed by muffled voices, coming from Mr. Riley's house. I didn't think much of it, but curiosity got the better of me, so I muted the TV and looked out the window. That's when I saw him. Mr. Riley was standing in his driveway, dragging something big toward the door leading to his basement. I couldn't quite make out what it was from where I stood, but it was large, wrapped in what looked like a dirty old blanket or tarp. He struggled with it for a minute, then finally shoved it through the basement door and disappeared inside. I remember thinking it was strange. What could an old man like him possibly be dragging into his basement that late at night? I didn't see him again for a few days, but the noises didn't stop. Every night after that, just as I was getting ready for bed, I'd hear that same banging sound, followed by what I could have sworn were muffled voices, like someone was talking or crying. The first time it happened, I brushed it off, convincing myself I was being paranoid. But as the days went on, the sounds became more frequent, more distinct, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. A week later, I was out mowing my lawn when I caught a whiff of that smell again. The same metallic, rotten scent I'd noticed before, but this time it was stronger, almost unbearable. It was coming from Mr. Riley's house, seeping out from the cracks in his basement windows. I stopped what I was doing and went over to check. I tried to peer through the basement window, but it was so dirty, I could barely see anything inside. All I could make out was a faint light and some shadowy shapes moving around. I started to feel sick. I had no proof, but something deep in my gut was telling me that whatever was happening in that basement wasn't normal. I decided I needed to get a closer look, Later that night, I couldn't sleep. The noises from the house were louder than ever. It sounded like someone was crying, soft, desperate cries that sent chills down my spine. I grabbed a flashlight, threw on a jacket, and went outside. I figured I'd walk by, maybe get another look through the window, and see if I was just imagining things. When I got to his yard, I noticed the basement door was slightly ajar. My heart started racing. I knew I shouldn't, but something compelled me to go closer. I inched my way toward the door, my breath catching in my throat. The closer I got, the stronger that awful smell became. It was so overpowering I had to cover my nose with my sleeve just to keep from gagging. I stood there for a moment, debating whether to open the door or turn back. But then I heard it again. The sound of someone crying, followed by a voice, low and harsh. "Shut up," it hissed. Without thinking, I pushed the door open just enough to peer inside. My flashlight flickered as I shone it into the dark basement, and what I saw nearly made me drop it. There were chains hanging from the ceiling, attached to the wall in the far corner, and slumped against the wall, tied up, was a woman. Her face was bruised, and she looked terrified. I froze in place, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. That's when I heard the sound of footsteps. Heavy, slow footsteps coming down the stairs. I panicked, backing away from the door, but it was too late. Mr. Riley appeared at the top of the steps, his eyes locking onto mine. For a split second, neither of us moved. Then he let out this low growl, almost animalistic, and started charging down the stairs toward me. The muffled scream from the chained woman snapped me out of my fear, and I barely dodged a reckless lunge by Mr. Riley as he crashed into a pile of boxes. The boxes collapsed onto him with a loud metallic rattle and trapped him underneath. I quickly bolted. I don't think I've ever run so fast in my life. I sprinted back to my house, slammed the door shut, and called the police. It felt like hours before they showed up, though it was probably only minutes. When the cops went into Mr. Riley's house, they found the woman in the basement, just as I'd seen her. She'd been missing for nearly a month, kidnapped by Riley, who'd been keeping her down there, abusing her. He'd lured her in by pretending to be a kindly old man in need of help. And that wasn't the worst part. Mr. Riley wasn't there. He managed to untangle himself and escape before the police could arrive. The police later told me that he'd done it before. There were signs that she wasn't the first person he'd kept in that basement. I try not to think about what would have happened if I hadn't gone over there that night, if I hadn't heard the noises, if I just kept ignoring them like I wanted to. Mr. Riley was arrested, of course, and the woman survived, but the whole thing haunts me to this day. I moved into my apartment about 6 months ago. It's in a decent part of town, nothing fancy, but affordable, and the landlord seemed like a good guy. He gave me a quick rundown of the place when I signed the lease. Utilities included, no pets allowed, and, as a side note, he casually mentioned that my next-door neighbour was an elderly woman who had lived there for years. He said she mostly kept to herself, but could be a little strange. I didn't think much of it at the time. I've dealt with strange neighbours before. What's the worst that could happen? I'd only seen her a couple of times in passing when I first moved in. She was small, hunched over, and always wore these old, faded house dresses. Her face was pale and wrinkled, her hair thin and white. She never said a word, just shuffled down the hallway with her head down, like she didn't want anyone to notice her. Things were fine at first. I unpacked, settled in, and started to enjoy the peace and quiet of my new place. But after a couple of weeks, I started noticing things that made me feel uneasy. It started with the knocking. It wasn't loud or frequent, but it would happen at the oddest times, like at 3 or 4 in the morning. At first, I thought maybe it was coming from another apartment, but it was definitely coming from my door. It would be this soft, deliberate knock, like someone was tapping their knuckles lightly against the wood. The first few times, I ignored it, thinking maybe it was some kind of sleepwalking or confusion on the old woman's part. But one night, the knocking woke me up again, and I decided to check it out. I dragged myself out of bed, still groggy, and went to the door. I stood there for a second, listening, waiting for it to happen again. Sure enough, tap, tap, tap. I unlocked the door and pulled it open, expecting to see the old woman standing there. But the hallway was empty. I leaned out and looked both ways. Nothing. No one. I figured maybe she had knocked and wandered off before I got there, so I went back to bed. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The knocking continued over the next few nights. I never managed to catch her at the door, though I was sure it was her. The worst part wasn't the knocking itself. It was the way it made me feel. It wasn't a friendly knock, or even the kind you'd expect from someone who was confused. It was deliberate, slow, like whoever was doing it was trying to get my attention and make me uncomfortable. I finally asked the landlord about her when I saw him in the hallway one afternoon. I mentioned the knocking and asked if he knew anything about it. He sighed and gave me a sort of apologetic smile. "Yeah, that's Mrs. Holloway," he said. "She's been here forever. I think she gets lonely sometimes. Just try not to engage with her too much. She can be a bit much, you know?" I didn't really know what he meant by that, but I took his advice and left it alone. Maybe she was just lonely, and this was her way of reaching out. But as time went on, her behavior got stranger. Sometimes late at night, I'd hear her pacing in the hallway outside my door. The sound of her slippers dragging across the floor would wake me up, and it would go on for what felt like hours, back and forth, like she was patrolling the hallway. Other times I'd hear her whispering to herself, though I could never make out what she was saying. It was eerie, the way her voice would carry through the thin walls in the dead of night. One night, things got worse. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard the familiar sound of knocking again. This time, it wasn't soft. It was harder, more insistent, like whoever was knocking wanted me to come to the door immediately. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. Something about this knock felt different. I got up, my legs shaky, and walked to the door. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the doorknob. I don't know why, but I felt this deep sense of dread, like something bad was waiting for me on the other side of that door. Still, I couldn't just ignore it. I slowly turned the knob and opened the door, and there she was, Mrs. Holloway. She was standing just inches from the threshold, staring at me with these wide, unblinking eyes. Her face was expressionless, her skin almost grey in the dim light of the hallway. Her hair was matted, and she was wearing the same faded house dress as always. For a moment, neither of us said anything. We just stood there, staring at each other. Then, in the softest, most unsettling voice, she whispered, "You shouldn't be here." I blinked, trying to make sense of what she'd just said. "Excuse me?" "You shouldn't be here," she repeated, her voice a little louder this time. "This place, it's not safe. You need to leave before it's too late." I was too stunned to respond. My mind was racing. Was she trying to scare me? Warn me? Or was she just not all there mentally? Before I could say anything else, she turned and shuffled away, disappearing into her apartment. I closed the door, locking it behind me, and sat down, my heart still pounding. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her warning than just the ramblings of an old woman. That night, I barely slept. The final straw came a few nights later. I was getting ready for bed, brushing my teeth in the bathroom, when I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a faint scratching noise, coming from the wall directly behind me. The wall that separated my apartment from Mrs. Holloway's. At first, I thought maybe it was a mouse or some kind of animal, but as I listened, I realized it wasn't an animal at all. It was the sound of fingernails, dragging slowly across the wall, like someone was clawing at it. I stood there, frozen, listening as the scratching continued, growing louder. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I bolted out of the bathroom and went straight to the door, but when I opened it, the hallway was empty. I checked the peephole and saw no sign of her. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing the faint scratches and whispers as I lay there in the dark, unable to shake the feeling that Mrs. Holloway wasn't just trying to scare me. She was trying to warn me about something worse. The next morning, I packed my things and left. I didn't even bother telling the landlord why I was moving out early. I just needed to get away from that place, and from her. I've tried not to think about it too much since then, but every now and then, I'll wonder, what was she trying to warn me about? What was waiting in that apartment complex in the walls that she knew about and I didn't?